Okay, hi. The subject of tonight's class is called the Objectivity of Morality. Now, before I begin, let me give a brief introduction of what the goal of this class is going to be. The goal of this class is to understand that we have a certain objective moral framework, meaning, what do I mean by an objective moral framework? I mean, when I say something is good, something is bad, I'm talking about something objective. I'm relating to something real about the world and the universe. I'm not simply expressing my own personal viewpoint, like the best color of ice cream is chocolate or vanilla. That we understand is an opinion. This is what I want to say about morality, is that it's something that is actually objective, relating to something real in the world. Now, what do we intend to gain by understanding this? I think there's three things we can gain from this. Firstly, more on a very basic level, understanding more about the world, understanding more about what our moral relationship is to the world, as well as being able to answer a skeptic, meaning a person who wants to say there's no objective morality, meaning when I say something's good and you say something's evil, or I say something's evil and you say something's good, we're not actually talking about something objective, we're talking about something subjective. And the last two are more practical. Firstly, I think it will allow us to gain a deeper relationship with God if we understand our moral relationship with Him. And lastly, a relationship to His commandments and halacha. So, to begin with, I'm going to take the side of the critic, meaning I'm going to take the side to be able to illustrate to you that morals are objective. I'm going to take the side of the critic, meaning the person who wants to say there's no objective morality. By taking his side, I want to see if he can hold his position and hold the fact that all morality is subjective. And if he fails to hold his position, I think we'll be able to show that they haven't been able to hold their position. Now, I'll give a brief introduction to how I'm going to do this. There's a concept called the burden of proof. The burden of proof is that if someone holds a position, they have to give reasons for their position. But that goes to either side who wants to hold a position. Meaning, if you have a court case, you have the accuser and you have the defendant. It's the accuser's job to show the court that this person's guilty. It's the defense's job to not show that he's innocent, simply show that the accuser hasn't held his position right. You with me? In that case, the accuser has the burden of proof. But when it comes to a general discussion, and you have two sides, and they both want to hold a position, each side, in theory, has a burden of proof. Meaning, if you want to hold a position and say, I think X is true, you have to hold and explain why you think X is true. If you're on the other side and you say, but no, X is not true, you also have a burden of proof. You also have to be able to hold your position. Now, if a person says, the reason I'm saying this is because generally when it comes to a discussion of morality, people will say, well, the critic will say to the person who thinks morals are objective, will say to him, well, you think morals are objective, you think there's something real when you say, do not kill, do not steal, you think you're referring to something real in the universe. Prove to me your position. And the person who wants to say morals are objectives will flounder about, not necessarily know how to hold his position, in which case the critic will look at him and say, well, see, morals aren't objective. Well, I'm trying to show that's not the case. If the person who wants to say morals are objective cannot give good reason, it doesn't fall to the side of the subjective, to the critic. It stays in, we don't know. So what I want to do in this discussion is, we're at a stage now we don't know, whether it's objective or subjective. I want to put the burden of proof on the critic and ask him for what his reasons are to say that morals are subjective. Are there any questions so far? Okay. What are the reasons that the critic can give to why morals are subjective? There's two basic reasons that I'm aware of, and if you know of more and you've got any other ideas, we can discuss them. Firstly, he says, generally speaking, when it comes to morality, there's a lot of confusion and a lot of disagreement when it comes to morality, meaning some people say this is moral, some people say that is moral. Take, for example, capital punishment. Well, there's some people say it's moral and some people say it's immoral. Taxation. These things are debated. And he looks at the person who wants to say morality is objective and say, well, isn't that a good argument to say morality is subjective?
I'm sorry, what's the argument? The argument is because other people
there's lots of disagreement when it comes to morality. I think taxation is moral. You don't. Or many other things. There's the person trying to put over the point of view that...
That's what the world does.
Exactly. So doesn't that show that morality is subjective? So the answer we give to him and say is, well, not really. Because true, there's debate and there's confusion when it comes to a moral idea with different dimensions. But when we come to straightforward single moral principles with a single dimension, there's basically agreement. For example, torturing children for fun. Would you find anybody who would say that's moral? Of course not. Well, you see, I added in the end for fun, meaning I blocked out any other moral considerations. When it comes to things with single moral principles and single moral dimensions, there's no disagreement. We generally speaking all agree. And these are the foundations. Everybody agrees on the foundations. The only time confusion comes up is when you have competing moral ideas. For example, taxation. You're robbing from the rich, but you're giving to the poor. Now, how do you balance those two up? This is where the debate comes in. But things with single moral dimensions, there's no disagreement. Let's move on to the second argument to the critic. The critic will say, well, in moral philosophy, there's been no progress to find out exactly what is moral and what's not moral. In moral philosophy, there's much debate and there's a lot of people trying to come up with different theories about how to describe morality. There's utilitarianism, there's the golden rule, all these ideas that have their pros and have their cons to explain what is considered like to have a moral theory that can apply to everything. But we don't have anything everybody agrees on in terms of having a good moral principle. Maybe that's a good argument to say why morality is subjective. The answer to that is that, well, just because we don't have an answer yet, that doesn't mean that we'll never get an answer. Take, for example, the sun. 2,000 years ago, did they know what made the sun shine? What the night sky was, what the stars were? They didn't have a clue. Did they have any method of finding out? Did they have any... Well, they had different proposals. Like, for example, they used to look at the night sky, and they used to see a blue thick, like they used to see a blue, like a blue dark screen in the sky with dots in it. So what did they think it was? They thought it was a sheet of thick material, and what were the spots in the sky were the cracks that was letting the light through. Now that was wrong. And for example, now we know what makes the sun shine. We think it's nuclear fusion. Now, back then when they were debating and trying to work out what actually was making the sun shine, well, they had no idea, and they were not getting any closer to the idea. But did they say, well, then there's no objective morality to it? Sorry, there's no objective fact to what makes the sun shine? Now, these two arguments, I mean, there's more arguments that the critic can bring. For example, there's throughout time and history and different places, there's been different things that people thought were moral. The Aztecs, they used to think it was very moral to sacrifice their children to Quetzal. It's the name of the Aztec god. Now, they thought that was moral. Today, we don't. 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, different places of the world, they all had different ideas of what was considered moral and what wasn't considered moral. Wouldn't this be a good argument to say why morality is subjective? Well, argument against that is that not really. First of all, just because different places over the world had different opinions about what was moral and what wasn't moral, how does it follow then that the whole project is subjective? And taking it a step further, the things that they disagreed on wasn't the principles once again, it was their viewpoint of the world. The Aztecs thought that if they didn't sacrifice their children to Quetzal, there would be a famine, and everybody would die. Well, if you actually believed that, well, then it would still fit in the same moral framework that we're giving to sacrifice your children to the god. Meaning, when it comes to the fundamental foundational point, we still agree. So, these three arguments, from a purely philosophical standpoint, about why morality is not subjective. Are there any questions till this point? You're with me?
But the fact that they argue on certain points because there's conflicting ideas, does that mean it's subjective?
So what I want to say is, they argued back then, and they
I
argue
mean,
today.
According to the first thing you said, that there's certain points everyone agrees on, certain points that they're conflicting morals.
Correct. So I want to say to the critic that, well, that's not a good reason to say the entire project is obviously subjective
But
and
he
has...
does have an argument that parts of morality decisions are.
Correct, he does.
Okay.
But remember, we're asking him to hold the burden of proof that morality is subjective.
Across the board.
And we're saying, well, actually, there's a lot of agreement in ethics. And to end off, people are still working on it. In universities today, in the philosophy of ethics, they're still debating and they're still trying to come up with a theory that works. Now I'm going to take it from a slightly different perspective. There was a Russian called Dostoevsky who came up with a statement: if there is no God, everything is permitted. Meaning, if God hadn't commanded us what to do and what not to do, we wouldn't know, and morality would be subjective without God's commandment. What I'm doing now is taking it from a theist's point of view. Same sort of idea. He's trying to say morality is subjective, but as we have God's command, God telling us what to do, and God's God, we now know what's objective and what's not. You follow the point? We're taking it from a different point of view now. We're taking it from a point of view of a person trying to tell us that yes, morality, it's the same position as the critic, but we're adding God into it. He's saying yes, morality is completely subjective, but because we know what God said, we now know what is objective and what's not objective.
So it is subjective or it's not subjective?
Meaning, according to him, we have God's command.
To set up courts. Let's say.
No, for example, let's take that for example.
Okay.
Because God commanded us that, we know that's moral, and we know that's objectively moral. And if God hadn't told us that, we wouldn't know.
Maybe it could be subjectively. Maybe God told us to set up subjective.
Could be, but the point he's trying to make, what the critic's trying to make here, is that he's trying to take the same position as the person before.
Okay.
Morality is subjective.
Okay.
But because I have God's word, I now know what's objective. So I'm going to try and show how this isn't true either, because if this person holds his position, true, God's involved, but once again, we don't have an objective moral framework. What we're trying to argue for is an objective moral framework of moral principles that we can work with that we know inherently exist. He's trying to say, no, none of that exists. I know what God said, and because I know what God said, I now know what's objective. And without God, I wouldn't know. So we're going to take the same sort of ask him to hold the burden of proof again. Why do you think this? And for him to hold this position, he once again has to show why without God, morality is subjective. And he would have to go through the same three arguments that the previous critic brought.
So do I understand subjectivity of morality as a negative, something negative, or what?
He's trying to show that, correct. I'm trying to show that we don't want to say morality is subjective. We want to say morality is objective.
Still, we put subjectivity of morality, we think that it's negative. It has a negative meaning, right?
Well, from my point of view, yes, because I don't want to say it's subjective, because I believe it's objective. So I'm trying to argue against the position that it's subjective. Now, even bringing God into the picture, meaning even if a person says, because I have God's command, it's objective. Without God's command, it's subjective. For him to hold this position, he has to once again show how without God, it's subjective, in which case he has to do the same three arguments of the previous person. But then we're going to take it a step further. We also have positive reasons to say why simply just having God's command isn't enough to tell us what's objective and what's subjective. What do I mean by that? If he wants to say there's no objective morality, and all there is God's word, we ask him the question, what about God makes us sure that when he says it, it's moral? Think about the question. What if you say there's no moral principles and there's no moral foundation? What about God lets us know that when he makes a command, it's truly moral?
Doesn't he explain us?
Sorry?
Doesn't he explain it? Like, we need to understand whether it's moral or not within the context of what he is telling us today.
So from the point of view of this critic, he's saying there's no objective morality. He's saying when God speaks, I then know that is moral. I ask him from like sort of a positive argument against his position. Why, when God speaks, do I know it's moral? What quality of God confirms to me that when he gives me a command, it's moral? You can't say when God speaks, it's moral because it reflects what's moral, because according to this person's position, there is no moral objectivity. It's only God's word. So let's go through the characteristics.
Why can't God's word be objective morality?
I'll explain. Okay. Think about God's word. What about God lets us know that when he speaks, it's moral?
How do you define morality, Adam?
When God says, do not kill.
Yeah.
And remember, we're wearing the hat of the critic. He says there's no objective morality. Okay? He says there's no objective morality to the world. Everything's subjective. Okay. Then when God speaks, I know it's moral because God said it.
Well, you could decide what God said.
Well, no. Assuming he's got a book that says God said, do not kill. How do I know that just because God said it, it reflects true morality? Is it because God's powerful? Do we believe might makes right?
Maybe if you define morals as the word of God, then...
Correct, but nobody does that.
So what we just need to understand what means subjective and objective. So subjective means that it comes from us, and objective it comes from some source of information, some source of
correct.
Which is a reliable one.
So to repeat our position is we want to say there is an objective morality to the universe, to the world, and the critic wants to say, no, that doesn't exist. Now, I'm even taking it from a point of view of a person who says there's no objective morality, but when God speaks, it is moral just because God said it.
What's the definition of an objective morality?
Objective morality would be something along the lines of, when I say do not kill, I'm reflecting something objective, meaning I'm saying a truth. I'm not simply giving my opinion. The person who says it's subjective, he's saying, when I say do not kill, I'm expressing a personal preference.
Right.
So,
but a truth means that it's truth in the eyes of the world?
Truth meaning objectively, abstractly. Meaning, when I say the world is round, am I saying a truth about the universe?
Okay, yeah.
Same sort of idea. When I say do not kill, I'm saying something true about the universe. That's what my position is. Now, once again, the critic says that isn't the case. The critic's saying that there is no objective morality. All there is subjective opinion, and when God speaks, that is moral. Now, if we go through the characteristics of God being powerful, just because God is all-powerful, how would we know what he's saying is moral? God knowing everything. Once again, we could ask, well, just because he knows everything, does that make it moral? Now, the true answer is, you could say something like this, because God is perfectly moral, let's just say, but he can't take that position. This critic can't take that position, because if I say God is perfectly moral, what am I saying? God is perfect in reference to morality. Once again, I'm referring to an objective morality. Now, this critic can't take that position. He has to say somehow within and of itself it's moral. And what from God within himself, without referring to anything else, will be able to hold the idea that it's moral? Are there any questions to this point?
God is perfect in the way he sees the world. Nature, how he defines things, is perfect. How he understands them. Surely that should make it moral.
How so?
He's defined what perfect is.
So you're saying as he did...
Facts of the universe.
But that, once again, you're saying that he makes the universe with what is and what is not moral, and thereby he'll make a statement and it will be moral.
Yes.
Well, that's not what the critic is saying. The critic is saying, without God telling me what the case is, there is nothing. There is nothing. Meaning, just by his word, I know it's moral.
No,
but if
God's word you'll have morality, you have subjective morality.
Correct.
With God's word you'll have
objective. Without
God's you'll have subjective.
Then I ask, how do you know A, it's subjective to begin with, in which case we have the three arguments from the person before, and secondly, if you say with God's word it is objective, well, how do I know it's objective? If you want to say because he's perfectly moral, or because he knows what is moral, well then I'm saying you're referring to something outside of God, which you don't want to say exists. You want to say there's no objective morality outside God. So if he wants to say the reason why when God speaks it's objectively moral, Well, he's referring to something outside of God. And once again, he can't take that position because he's saying outside of God's word, there is no objective morality. So it's doubly flawed. Taking this position is both flawed on the point of view of the argument from the critic to begin with, and positively from his point of view of saying when God speaks, it becomes moral, because we ask, well, how do you know? You with me? So now we've taken it from the point of view of, well, from a philosophical point of view and asked them to hold their position. And they haven't. Now I'm going to change the focus slightly. I'm going to take the focus to our sources. And within our sources, once again, I'm quoting Rabbi Gottlieb here, he's got 16 on his website, 16 sources throughout our tradition that we hold the contrary. We hold, from our tradition, that morality is objective, without God's command. Taking it from the Talmud, where we have a certain category of laws called mishpatim. Right. And we're told that these are the sort of laws that you should know without God telling you. Moving it closer up, Reb Nissengarn says that there are certain, this is just the period just after the Talmud, where they were called the Geonim, and he says, well, there are certain commandments that you should know logically. And the 7 Noachite laws, besides those, there are also all the moral ones that you would know from your own person. The Rambam says that you will be judged to reward and punishment from the logical ones, the logical commandments, or the logical, well, not commandments, the logical laws and the logical moral things that you know on your own front without it being commanded by a prophet. You will be rewarded and punished for these. Meaning if you know something's wrong logically and it hasn't been commanded, you will be held accountable for this. Now moving it even closer to our time.
So what, can you say that some morality is objective, some morality...
Meaning what I'm trying to show here is that from our sources, within our tradition, besides it being certain, like a certain intuitive that we feel that there is a certain objective morality, from our tradition, meaning from our sources, I'm saying we hold this position as well. Not only is the critic not able to hold his point of view, from our sources, from our position, we also say morality is objective. There's an objective good and bad to the universe that is there as a framework.
Right.
And now bringing it closer to the 20th century, there's a Rav called Rav Shimon Shkop. Now Rav Shimon Shkop said, ask the question, property. What gives a person property? Is it that God says, do not steal certain items, and thereby God points at certain items and says, do not steal them, and thereby it gives the person ownership of them? Or is it the other way around? People first have ownership, and then God says, do not steal them. Do you follow the dichotomy, the split? Which one is it? And he says it's the latter. Ownership comes first. Before God tells you not to steal, ownership exists as a moral principle. And he proves it. You've heard from different sources that one of the motivations for serving God is gratitude. We thank God for all he's done for us. Well, he asked the question, well, how can I thank God for all he's done for us based off gratitude if I haven't been commanded to have gratitude? And he says, well, it's obvious. Gratitude comes first. There is an inherent idea of gratitude, and when you recognize what God's done for you, you owe him gratitude. And taking it further, there's another source I forgot. There's a discussion in the medievals about why exactly we have to pay back our loans. If I borrow something new, I borrow money from you, why do I have to pay it back? What law is there? Pay back your loan. It's a halachic discussion how exactly it goes about. It's fascinating. But the Tosfos Horosh says, you pay back what you borrow because you borrowed it. Meaning he says that comes first. You with me? So just to recap where we're standing here, the critic hasn't been able to hold his position, and we have positive reasons, both from, I suppose, our intuitive point of view, but also from our tradition, that morality is objective, meaning there's an objective moral framework which from our tradition and our sources we recognize. Are there any questions?
Do we have more than objective morality? Is everything that we do...
Meaning we have an objective moral framework which we acknowledge, meaning when you say, I say it's wrong to torture small babies for fun.
I mean, bring a carbon is kind of, It seems immoral.
So we'll get onto that sort of discussion at the end.
Okay.
So what I want to do here now is, like, if we've established that morality isn't dependent on God, of course it's dependent on, I mean, we believe God created the universe. But if we don't think God's command is needed to tell us what's moral and what's not moral, because as I described from our sources, we knew that before God gave us the Torah. God gave us the Torah and he told us different things. But before that, we also knew what was right and what was wrong. Meaning, from our source's position, when a person said, do not torture a small baby for fun, do not kill, do not steal a person's article, we knew that already. In which case we come up with the question, well, why is God relevant to morality at all? You follow the question? So the answer lies in two fronts. First one is fairly trivial, and the second one's more what's going to be the main thrust of my point. First one is the facts. Well, once you know there's a God in the world, you have a completely different collection of facts to work with. Meaning, circumcision. To cut your child. Well, that would strike you as slightly immoral. I mean, go around cutting people's children is a bit of a strange thing to do, similar like to carbonos. But once you add God into the picture, you have a new collection of facts now. I know God made a covenant with Abraham. Now, if I believe that to be true, and a sign of that covenant was circumcision, well, I now have new facts with which to work with to be able to act my moral framework on. I have a new basis of facts. For example, the carbonos, killing an animal. A person may say, well, why am I killing an animal? But once you have the collection of facts from the Torah about why we're doing it and why it's important, you now have a different collection of facts to which to base your moral judgment on. And that's what God introduces into the picture. You with me on the first front? Now the second one is more of what I want to discuss. If we agree there's a moral framework, all right? Take gratitude, for example. Take ownership, for example. These are two moral principles. Now, there may be others that give God, well, I'll start with these two. Ownership. Billy and Jim. Billy's walking down the street. Billy's walking in the Alps. And Billy's about to fall off the cliff. Jim saves him. Now, Jim has just saved Billy. Billy owes Jim a certain debt of gratitude. Correct? Now, when Jim asks Billy to do something for him, Billy is somewhat obligated to do whatever within a certain extent, what Jim asks of him. If Jim says to Billy, I want you to paint my house, please. Billy's going to be like, wow, of course, you saved my life. Of course I'm going to paint your house for you. We can understand that. There's a certain moral obligation on the side of Billy to Jim. You follow? Well, now from our position, let's bring God into the picture now. Well, what do we owe God from this point of view of gratitude?
Our lives, all we have.
Our lives, our health, our sustenance. Think about God as a moral, we give him, through our moral principles, a certain moral authority. God comes up to you and says, I want you to put leather boxes on your head and your arms. I can understand from a moral point of view, from a point of view of gratitude, besides other reasons, of course, but from a point of view of gratitude, we have a moral relationship with him now. Well, I can put on those boxes in the morning because I recognize what God did for me. Now, this gives God a certain amount of moral authority. Take ownership, for example. Ownership is a moral principle. Now, if I own something, it's very difficult to say, like, what point you own something. But let's say I create something, ex nihilo, from nothing. I think that's probably the most potent way of describing ownership. If I create something, right now, in the middle of this table, I create Whiskers, a cat called Whiskers. This cat I have created from nothing. Well, I can do what I want with this cat to a certain extent. I can tell you not to touch it, to do what, it's my cat. Now let's bring God into the picture. What does God own exactly? Without getting into the discussion whether God owns people or doesn't own people, but God definitely owns cats, mountains, desks. I mean, he's the creator behind everything. Well, now let's say he owns pigs. And he says to the Jewish people, do not eat pigs. Now, with this moral relationship in mind, let's reinterpret those words. don't eat these pigs because they're my pigs, and I don't give you permission to eat them. Now, going ahead and eating a pig now is violating a moral principle that we have with God. You were with me. So to recap, we have a moral framework. And then once we bring God into the picture, we apply these moral principles to God, and they give him a certain moral authority. Are there any questions?
So how does this moral framework, deal with objectivity of morality? I didn't understand.
I'll restate the argument.
Yeah.
We wanted to say that morals were objective.
I mean, just connect our idea to this beautiful picture of
The relationship with God.
of the framework of moral framework which you just outlined.
Okay, if we say that there is a certain moral objectivity, meaning gratitude. If I make a promise to you, and let's say I promise I'll press a button tomorrow morning. The button's right next to my bed. There's no other competing, not that if I press the button, simple, press the button, and I promise I'll do it for you. Am I morally obligated to do it? If we agree there's a moral framework, well, I promised it to you. You do something for me, I'm morally obligated to have gratitude to you. If we accept that these are truths, and the way I demonstrated that was to show that the critic couldn't hold his position, and in our sources, we seem to say that is the case, that there is a moral objectivity to the universe. And then we just simply bring God into the picture. Gratitude to God? Well, he's done a lot for us, hasn't he? Ownership? God owns quite a bit. So if we apply these moral principles to God, we then get a different relationship with him that we had without this knowledge. Meaning, I'll give an example. In certain sectors of Judaism, there's people like to make a distinction between the symbolic mitzvahs and commandments to the moral commandments. Meaning, there's keep Shabbos, which you can do if you don't, simply like a symbolic gesture, or do not kill. And there's an emphasis on the do not kill because it's a moral thing, and if you kill people, you steal from people, you're immoral. But things like Shabbos and kashrus and things like that, well, you can be a symbolic person and you can't be a symbolic person, but it's nothing to do with morality. Well, I'm saying now that let's take this into account. Ownership and gratitude on the point of view of God, we give God a certain moral authority that when I eat pig, or I don't do what he says, I'm also bringing that into the moral sphere. So I'm saying with understanding that morality is objective, we then bring God into the picture, and then we have a different relationship with him, more of a moral obligation to him, as well as potentially others. But we get a moral obligation to God which enriches our lives, enriches our relationship to him as well. Because when we get up in the morning and we put on tefillin, and maybe it's difficult or just simply having this in mind that not only am I doing it because you said, I'm also doing it because I have gratitude to you. And how do I have gratitude to you? Because I know what you did for me. Now, to give it, I suppose, a fuller picture, to really close it up, what I'm saying here is that God does have a certain limit to these moral principles. What do I mean by this? Let's take ownership, for example. Or when I said that God has a certain moral authority, specifically with these two which we've discussed, there's a limit to how far it goes. What do I mean by that? I mean that God is beholden to this morality, this moral framework which we're discussing. For example, gratitude. Jim and Billy. Jim saved Billy's life. Now, Billy's going to paint his house for him, right? That makes sense, right? What happens if Jim says to Billy, I don't only want you to paint my house, I want you to kill yourself? Now, we would probably say that's going too far. Billy's not going to kill himself just because Jim asked. Or take ownership, for example. As I said, I just created Whiskers. I can take Whiskers to the shops, I can pet it, I can feed it. Can I torture Whiskers now? Probably not. What, because I created it, I can torture it? So if we apply, once again, these limitations to God, we're saying there's a limitation to where God can and can't go when it comes to the moral framework. And I'm going to prove this. In Bereshis, when Avram's talking to God, and Avram says to God, Abraham says to God when he's about to destroy the city of Sodom, he says to God, are you going to destroy the righteous along with the wicked? Will the judge of the universe be unjust? Now, God didn't look at Abraham and say, wait a minute, I'm doing it. If I'm doing it, then by definition it's justice. He didn't. He said, no, I'm not going to do that. Do you follow? Taking another example, there's a big question in our sources, which is when bad things happen to good people. From Job all the way till today, people discuss this problem. You have two premises. A person's suffering, you see no good reason why he's suffering. You ask the question, why is this man suffering? It's the question of why bad things happen to good people. Now, nobody answers this question with, wait a minute, I don't understand the question. If God did it, by definition it's moral. That's not how we answer the question. We attack one of the two premises. We either say the person isn't really suffering as much as you think, or there's a certain amount of good that's coming through the person suffering, or he deserved it, or other answers to explain why the bad is happening. We explain why the bad is happening. We don't simply say that, well, God's doing it, so obviously it's moral. Do you follow? So there are other moral principles and other ideas that would grant God more moral authority than simply ownership and gratitude. For example, everything God does is for the best. If you know that to be a moral principle, that you know God will do things for your best interest, well, that gives him more moral authority. I'm saying this is probably a bit of a deep study that you could spend time on. But what I hope I've shown is that understanding that morality is objective, we can use that as a framework and a basis to build our relationship with God in a moral light. Not only just, obedience and this, that, the other. Certain things and other ideas of why we would do what God says can come into play. But if we add this moral sphere to things, we have a moral relationship with him, and we have a moral relationship with his commandments. Any questions?
Is morality based on, just according to what I've heard, is morality based on, let's say, the relationships between someone who has authority and someone who let's say, works for this person? Let's say, if we serve God and God has certain authority upon us, so are we moral because we have authority of God?
So what we're trying to say is no. I'm not saying God's moral because he has authority. I'm saying he has a moral authority from these principles we've discussed. For example, because God can hit you doesn't make it moral from what he says moral because he can hit you. That's not what we're saying. We're saying if we understand these basic moral principles and then we apply them to God, God has a moral authority over us, meaning, what do we owe God from a point of view of gratitude? Quite a bit. So when he says, put on those leather boxes, I can do that from a point of view of gratitude towards him, because I owe him so much. When God says, do not eat my pigs, we're not allowed to torture animals.
You said that we take this moral things and we apply them to God. So what is the source of these moral principles? If God is source of moral principles, so we take God's moral principles and apply them back to God?
So this moves on to a different idea. Now, I'm not saying that without there being a God, there would be no morality. Meaning, yes, God created the universe. Now, when God created the universe, could he have made the universe without any morality? Possibly, probably, yes. He could have just made the universe of us all being mice. If God had made only mice, would there be any morality? Yeah, probably not. But once God has made the universe in the way he's made the universe, morality sort of runs on its own. Take mathematics, for example. The point I'm trying to make is that it's not God's command that makes it moral. The morality comes first. Yes, God created the world with morality in it, but it sort of runs on its own, which means we can apply that moral framework to God, and we can serve God through a moral relationship. As I said, take mathematics. If God hadn't created the universe, would mathematics exist? Probably not, because there'd be nothing. Now, God has created the universe. Do I need to apply to God to be able to use mathematics? No, it sort of runs on its own. Same too with morality. The way I've demonstrated this is that people who want to say it's subjective cannot hold their position. From our own sources, we want to say it's subjective, it's objective. So once we have that objective framework that we believe God created, we then apply it to God, and we have a new moral relationship with him. Any questions? Anything that's unclear that I can clear up? So I suppose to end up on like another sort of note, which is quite funky. People will sometimes say, well, wait a minute, couldn't God make it moral to torture babies for fun? God's powerful. Could he not make it moral to torture? Maybe it is moral, according to God. In God's eyes, maybe it is moral to torture babies for fun. Now, in case you get this sort of question asked at you, the way to answer this question is sort of the same way you would answer the question of, can God make a stone too heavy for him to carry? Have you heard this question? Can God create a stone too heavy for him to carry? Think of the question.
Yes, he could.
Well, God could do something that would limit himself.
Probably not.
Can God make a square circle? Well, the way we answer a question like this is the same way we say, a person says, well, can't God make torturing small babies permissible? Well, I would say to a person who asks a question like that, well, I don't actually understand what you're saying. You're sort of contradicting yourself as you speak. Can God make a stone too heavy for him to carry? Well, can God, an all-powerful, limitless being, do something limiting?
Just for fun.
Meaning it's contradictory in the phrase. Meaning when the person asks a question like that, they're contradicting themselves as they speak. Square circle. A square is not a circle. You can say it, but there's no meaning behind it. Can God torture small babies for fun? Can he make it permissible? Well, torturing small babies for fun is the absolute antithesis of permissible. It's the complete opposite. So when you speak, you're not actually expressing anything. Fun way of putting it is, can God make colorless green sleep violently? That didn't make any sense, did it? So when a person speaks, you can say whatever you want, but you have to be coherent. You have to make sense if you're going to ask a question. So yes, we believe God created morality in the universe. He was the one who put down the moral framework. But once it's there, it sort of runs on its own. Thereby we can apply it to God. Without his command, we know what is moral and what is not moral, and then we can apply it to God and have a moral relationship with him. You good?
So when we speak about objectivity of morality, we take, let's say, this framework, and everything which is included into this framework, which was maybe created by God or created by us, and we apply it to God. And if we speak about subjectivity of morality, do we speak that subjectivity is something outside of this framework?
Let me explain the thing again and tell me where your question lies in it. We're trying to say, we have the critic who comes along and says, morality is subjective. There is no true right and wrong. We've shown that that person cannot hold his position. We say from our sources and intuitively, certain things truly are right and wrong. Now, if we know from our sources that we hold this position, we then know there is a certain moral framework. If we then bring God into the picture, a God who has done so much for us, who created the universe, and this framework we apply to God, we now have a moral relationship with him because he exists. And true, he created the universe with morality in it, but once again, that is there before he speaks. Meaning he's there, he created the universe, and he created a moral framework in it. And when we apply that to God, we have a moral relationship with God. And as I said, it's within limits, which means God lives up to this moral framework as well. And if we can see God lives up to this moral framework, we can see it's something, well, truly inherent and truly important. That means when we relate to God on a moral level...
But God kind of breaks the rules sometimes. It's like...
Who?
When you kill somebody, when you kill a murderer.
Well, think about it. When you kill a murderer,
Right.
you're adding in another dimension. You don't just kill someone for fun. You attack me, I kill you first. Well, why did I do that? Was it immoral to kill you? Well, in that case, not so, because you were going to kill me.
Right. But if killing is immoral, then once the guy already killed somebody, why add another death?
Well, because he hasn't killed you yet. You're saying punishment.
Yeah.
Well, punishment, well, there's another moral reason why you would want it, because you want to prevent more people killing people. If I don't have any punishment for crime, well then, I potentially have more people getting killed.
Right.
So now we're getting conflicting moral ideas.
Right.
Thank you for coming.